Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Rev Rx Podcast, where we show you how to thrive in faith, family, and health. My name is Chad Potts, and I'm your host. Let's be real. Most of us feel tired all the time. If you're the exception to that rule, then congratulations. But if you're like me, there's been periods of fogginess, feeling stressed, no energy. But what if the root problem for feeling that way isn't age, isn't genetics, it isn't even the fact that your kids keep you up at night? What if it's inflammation? And what if one of the best tools to fix it is absolutely free? What if it's something called fasting? This week on the Rev Rx Podcast, I'm talking with Dr. Bryana Gregory. You may recognize her from episode 20. I encourage you to go back and take a listen to that. But she's back. And we're digging into why so many of us feel so bad so much of the time, and how simply adjusting the times of the day in which we eat can change everything. It's not about starving. It's about healing. God designed our body to be able to heal itself in a lot of different ways, but here's the thing. Our modern lifestyles get in the way of some of those housekeeping tasks. So this episode is packed full of practical takeaways, real hope, and a fresh perspective on how to feel better in your body. You're going to want to buckle up for this episode. We try to take a lot of complex medical jargon and we try to make it approachable so that anyone listening to this can understand it. So without further ado, I introduce to you my friend, Dr. Bryana Gregory. Dr. Bryana Gregory, friend of the podcast, welcome back. You may remember her from episode 20. We had a fantastic conversation about how your genetics impact your health and the great work she's doing as a pharmacist and as a wellness expert. Love what you're doing. You're getting accolades. You're getting published. You're a wealth of knowledge. I find myself picking your brain occasionally. And so thanks so much for what you're doing. And thanks so much for joining us once again here on the Rev Rx Podcast.
Thank you, Chad. It's a pleasure to be back. I'm so happy that you brought me back, and I love tracking you and following you. And it's a pleasure to collaborate. As you know, I love collaborating with pharmacists, and I don't get to do that often. So this is such a fun conversation.
Yeah, sure. Same here. You know, when you think about healthcare and you think about, like I mentioned, the ever-changing landscape of what does it really look like to be healthy, there's so much, I'm just going to call it junk. There's so much junk out there. There's so much junk science. There's so many, you have all of these fad diets and you have all of these things that promise results, but generally overpromise and underdeliver. And you're at the cutting edge of a lot of different things. And one of the things that I find you as a tremendous resource for is the concept of fasting. Currently, I'm doing intermittent fasting myself. I don't eat until afternoon sometime. And I have found myself with a lot more energy. I found myself feeling better than I have in months. And a large part of what kind of got me, because I've tried it before. And I don't think I did it right. I didn't really notice any results. I've shed a few pounds too this go round, and but really I just feel better. And that's one of the things that you post a lot about, and I'd love to just kind of pick your brain about that. So when we think about fasting, and we're not talking about fasting from a spiritual perspective, that's a whole different conversation for a different day. But fasting has real health benefits. Can you help us think about that and just kind of reframe that in the world of health? Because a lot of people, we think about fasting, we're like, oh, isn't that dangerous? But what's the overview of what you would consider to be fasting, and maybe a couple of the different options out there for us and why it's good for us?
Yeah, for sure. Boy, it's like, where do we start, right?
That's a loaded question, right?
Yes, it is. It's a good loaded question. I am a huge proponent of fasting, which I oftentimes, depending on who I'm talking to, will refer to it as time restricted eating, because fasting sounds scary.
It
right?
does. Yeah.
It's like, so you're going to tell me I can't eat anything for many, many hours? Yeah. There's a lot of reasons why ancestrally, and even if we fast forward today, why time restricted eating or fasting just makes sense. Ancestrally, when we used to hunt and gather for our food, there were many, many hours between caloric consumption. And what that represents on larger scale is recovery, the body. So Obviously, many, many systems throughout the body need that rest and recovery and then the energy to be able to kick in. And you made the comment, which is interesting because when I first started fasting, I experienced the same thing. You get more energy. And doesn't that just seem counterintuitive?
It does. I'm eating less, but I feel better.
Right. So one of the main things scientifically that fasting supports is cellular autophagy or detoxification. So at a cellular level, we really want to support the purging of those dead cells or of the toxins that are building up in our cells that maybe just aren't functioning like they should be. And the reason we want that out is because high level, if you add up toxicity in all the cells, then you feel toxic. You feel like you're dragging. You feel fatigued. You feel like you have brain fog, which is why fasting promotes that alertness and that better sleep and combating fatigue and better energy because you've essentially offloaded toxins. And I want to be very clear that the word toxin, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, right? I mean, if you go outside and you start breathing, you're going to be exposed to toxins. I was in Georgia, beautiful state of Georgia last week, and that pollen whacked me hard.
Yes.
And, I was downtown and I was around some of the smog. Same thing here in Houston. You can't avoid it. And so doing routine time restricted eating like that is really important to be purging those toxins or just things that don't agree with the body, whether that is pollen or it is smog or it's toxins from the food that we're eating. And again, it doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong because we have toxin buildup. That is completely normal. But I do think that from an ancestral standpoint, we are meant to do that. In fact, we started seeing a lot of chronic issues crop up as technology evolved, as refrigeration became mainstream, as electricity became mainstream, because that evolved into convenience. And with convenience, we got very stagnant, right?
Well, and this idea of being constantly surrounded by food is a really novel idea looking back ancestrally. We've grown up to where food has always been readily available. And I think sometimes we just think, well, it's always been that way. But when you really look back and you see, just constantly taking in food and think about it, we eat 3 square meals a day, a couple snacks in between, sometimes a bedtime snack. We're not going longer than maybe 6 hours without food. And that's overnight.
Right.
And we're just constantly feeding ourselves. So if you think about it from a cellular level, our cells are constantly in that working phase. There's never that rhythm of rest for our bodies. And, even pulling it back to how important rest is for our bodies, it's equally as important for our cells, right?
I like that rhythm of rest. We seem to be more in a rhythm of busyness all the time. We need to help our bodies find that rhythm of rest because if we don't, then we're promoting inflammation, right? And then chronic inflammation leads to disease. So personally, the reason that I fast is I do feel better. But as a pharmacist, I've seen cancer rates just skyrocket. And I know you've seen the same thing.
Yep.
Especially in the past 5 years or so. And it's required a really aggressive pivot in the health space. What do? These were not the type of patients we saw before. How do we serve these people? How do we show up? How do we encourage them? How do we equip them with the knowledge to heal the body from the inside out rather than just over medicating, which is an interesting conversation for us to have as pharmacists. We're the medication people, right?
Right. We're the pill pushers.
We have the pill pushers, right? So we want to be more than that. And it's an opportunity to be more than that for our patients. But fasting is something that you'll see consistently show up in the cancer space because it is a metabolic disease. It is characteristic of metabolic dysfunction. It is toxicity overload. Not to mention, these patients are going to get a large medication regimen. And anything that is not naturally made by the body is going to be considered some sort of a toxin in a way. And obviously, in the case of chemotherapy, its job is to be toxic, right? To obviously kill off the cell.
That's how it works.
Yeah, exactly. So in any way that we can help them offload those toxins is going to be exceptionally helpful. And the more that we learn about that being characteristic of metabolic dysfunction, what is so incredible to me is the way that God has designed our bodies to shift and to be flexible.
Yeah.
And there's this great body of information about metabolic flexibility, right? Usually we talk about metabolism. When we think metabolism, we think, oh, I have a slow metabolism, so I'm overweight. I have trouble losing weight. But we tend to forget that every single cell in our body has its own metabolism. And so in the functionality of cancer and some of these other chronic diseases, what we see is actually a metabolic shift intracellularly. But God has given us the ability to make that shift back to the normal function of the cell because we can be metabolically flexible. The cancer patients in particular seem to have some trouble with that metabolic flexibility. So it's really nice if we can help them to shift back. So the conversation around fasting, it is so broad, but from a preventive standpoint, I want to do everything that I can to protect my body from toxin overload. That's why I personally do it. And then there's the added benefits of just feeling more energetic. And I see the same thing amongst my patients as well.
Yeah. And I think this is a good launching point for us because, there's a lot of people who, who kind of toyed around with the idea of fasting and may be interested in it, not real sure how to go about it. And of course, we always want to say, talk with your physician or someone who knows you, knows your chart, knows your medical conditions before you do this. Just kind of give that disclaimer. But what I want to say too is that it's kind of the way our bodies were designed. Is to be able to have these periods of offloading of sorts, kind of taking out the trash. Think about it. If you're in your home and you constantly just build up trash, because we purchase things, we have consumables, we have all of these disposable goods, and we throw them away in the trash can, and we never take that trash out. That's going to be a toxic place to live for a lot of different reasons. Can you imagine? Well, our cells are the same. They need this opportunity to take the trash out, so to speak. And fasting allows us that process of taking that out. And so it's no wonder that we feel better, right? It's no wonder we have more energy because we're allowing our bodies to get rid of some of that waste. And I love the way that you explained it. And I think that really helps us to think about that. Now, more of the practical side of fasting. So if someone was thinking about it and if they've been okayed with all of their issues that, chronic diseases and that sort of thing, how might they go about maybe putting their toe in the water, so to speak, of fasting? And what are some different options? How can they start doing that themselves?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the ways to kind of gauge if you would really benefit from fasting is if you have trouble fasting. So what that's telling us is that you are a little bit metabolically unstable. Your body has cravings that are driving your food consumption. So just keep that in mind. The reason I preface it with that is because don't get discouraged if you don't knock it out of the park on day one. So as you mentioned earlier, we're usually sleeping, maybe somewhere around 6 to 8 hours in an evening. But either way, you're already going to be able to start with that. You're not eating while you're sleeping, hopefully. So, you could have already got that under your belt. So then you can work with several hours in the morning of not consuming food. Now, it's really nice to be able to start with a goal of at least 12 hours, which is pretty easy for most people. They're usually doing at least 10, if not 12 already, hours without food. So what constitutes fasting versus not is another question. Water, you can definitely consume. That's if it's bubbly water. Now, not the flavored water, but carbonated water or regular water is fine. Also, black coffee or tea is fine. If you think about what you're able to consume when you go and you have lab work, that's still considered fasting. So that's okay. Once we start getting a little bit more into the details of fasting, you can usually put something around less than 50 calories in your coffee or tea, let's say in the morning, and get away without breaking your fast. So most people will start with this intermittent fasting, which is about 12 hours or so. So you can do 12 and 12 hours of fasting, 12 hours of eating. A lot of people will do, like you said, the 16 or 17 hours. And then they're doing somewhere, maybe 7 or 8 hours of a window of eating as well. And that works really nice. Since we just covered the topic of autophagy, AKA taking out the trash, I think this is a good time to explain where we hit that. The concept of fasting is so fascinating because, to your point, some people do really well on the every other day. Some people do really well on intermittent. Some people do really well on 72 plus hour fasts. So there's a dimmer switch that happens around 16 or 17 hours that pushes us into cellular autophagy. So if you think from the first minute that you start fasting, you get to hour 12, 13, 14, 15, and then around 16 or 17, it's like, boom, you start to hit cellular autophagy, you start purging the toxins, and it's not like it's going to make you sick. It's not like they're all just, the body is smart. It kind of leaks them out and allows you to purge it out of the body, a little bit at a time or in a safe way. But that's why I like to be able to get people to 16, 17, 18 hours plus, because that's when they start getting that benefit of autophagy. So to just start, get very clear on what breaks a fast and what doesn't. So, know what you can have while you're still going to be actively fasting so that you don't break your fast. If milk or dairy products are tolerated, even a half a cup of grass-fed milk or something in the coffee is going to be fine in the morning. Really, there are certain things that will maybe pull me out of a fast that wouldn't pull you out of a fast because we're two different human beings.
Right.
And certainly not going to get into all the details of this because this is a separate podcast on its own.
Maybe round 3.
Yeah, right. But what does it look like as a difference between men and women? So for men, you guys get it a little bit easier when it comes to fasting. You have more of that daily fluctuation in hormones, AM, PM, some that happens in the middle of the day, right? And hormones play a big role in our weight and our metabolism and our ability to fast. So for someone that's a very experienced faster, does really well fasting several days in a row. For a woman, that's going to look much different. It's going to look different if they are premenopausal, perimenopausal, postmenopausal. And also, what about during their cycle? So on a month-to-month basis, a lot of patients that I see, because I work in the hormone space too, is girls, and unfortunately, Chad, it's getting younger and younger. Young girls have crazy breast tenderness and crazy migraines prior to their cycle. And they're thinking, wow, what is going on? But they don't always make the connection that it actually has to do with their hormone cycle. So when we can use fasting like that as a tool, it works really nicely for people. And it's not all about calorie restriction. It's about feeding. It's about that feeding window too. What you break your fast with is nearly as important as the fasting itself. Because once you get past 24 hours or so, especially past 72 hours, you get a major recruitment of stem cells to the gut, which is great. And that's how you get that longevity benefit from fasting. But those cells have to eat something. And so when you break the fast, it's really nice to put fermented foods in there. Sauerkraut, high protein vegetables, things like this that are going to nourish and diversify that microbiome when you do break your fast and start eating. So it's not great to break it with a chocolate chip cookie as much as you're going to want it, especially if you haven't been eating for 72 hours.
Right. And it's that may feel really good in the moment. I've been waiting all day for this. But to me, that's kind of the opposite of why you should be doing this anyway. It's to really focus on giving our body what it needs to thrive. And that I'm all about that. What does our body need to thrive? And there's several different ways of thinking about it. Number one is God designed us miraculously. You can't study the human body and not see the fingerprint of God all over it. Just the intricate design of all the different things we described. Like all of these cells in our body have this process of working and getting rid of toxins and doing it in a way that doesn't make us sick. And, it's just a beautiful process. But then realizing that sometimes we can hijack that process and we can kind of abuse that process and we can get in the way of those natural processes happening and just allowing your body to do that house cleaning that it needs to do.
Right.
It's almost a detox of sorts. And we've kind of said everything but that term. And I think maybe some people can relate to that. It's almost a detox of sorts.
Yeah.
Getting to that area of autophagy. No, not to get away from fasting because this has been so valuable. But I want to talk about, we've mentioned several times in this conversation about metabolic diseases, about metabolic function, metabolic syndrome, and all of that. And, of course, I'm a health nerd and I'm all about that. But for some of our listeners out there that may not be quite as nerdy as me, or yourself, probably. I think you're probably in the same boat as me because we're a lot alike in that way. What does that mean? what does it mean to be metabolically healthy in your mind and in the research that you've seen?
Yeah. So the body is all about balance. And you'll frequently hear me say that we don't get sick because we have a low level of pharmaceutical drugs in our blood.
Not a
We get
medication deficiency.
It's not a medication deficiency. Thank you. It's usually one of two main things the way that I see it. Either the body is out of balance or it's deficient in something. And so it's incredible how many adversities our body faces throughout the day, and we have no idea because it's course correcting and it's pivoting. That to me overall is metabolism. We have a word in science called homeostasis, right? Which is just a fancy way of saying our normal balance. So every cell being balanced, our mood being balanced, our energy being balanced. And I would say that most of us don't really know what balance feels like because we've gotten so used to dealing with the little pain in our back or the little headaches that we have around our cycle or something like that. So when we say we have metabolic dysfunction and how that plays into the development of chronic disease, it means that the metabolism or the systems of every single cell in every single system, whether that's the cardiovascular system or the endocrine system or the lymphatic system or the GI system, the nervous system, if those cells are not happy because they are exposed to toxins or they have experienced a childhood trauma or they are experiencing an excess amount of stress, what happens again is this beautiful body that God has given us starts to kick into action. But we only have so many resources in our body. And when we talk about this, I think we should use the hormonal system or the endocrine system as an example because it's a really, really good one. Most people are familiar with adrenal fatigue or, having your cortisol kick in, having fight or flight. But that only lasts for so long. So when we're under stress, whether that's stress at work just because we're busy, whether we're having a really tough time at home, whatever it might be, whether we're dealing with an illness, essentially all those are stressors to the body. The body goes, it's okay. Let me go ahead and kick in. I'm going to give you some cortisol. I'm going to allow the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys, right, to kick out this cortisol to help mitigate the stress. It's going to be okay. But when that stressor is persistent over months and over years, which this happens frequently in our lives, and they go unrecognized how long they persist oftentimes, is the body only has so much cortisol and it's going to start pulling from other resources. So it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's when we start getting deficiencies. So we get this, increase in cortisol. It's starting to distill from other hormones. And then we don't make our sex hormones well, then we're feeling fatigued. Then our skin starts getting saggy when we get old. We don't have libido anymore, right? But the good news out of this conversation is if we go back to the root cause and we see where that stressor initially started,
mm-hmm.
we can actually correct that. And that's the beautiful thing. We don't have to over medicate because of all these symptoms that we're having. So when we talk about metabolic syndrome, we're talking about metabolism and a syndrome. That's metabolism. A syndrome is a collection of symptoms, which obviously is our body's way of communicating to us and say, hey, hello, I would love some help over here.
Yeah, symptoms are...
Yeah, please give me back what I'm deficient in.
Yeah, symptoms are so important. I think sometimes we ignore symptoms because we're just kind of used to them, right? Oh, it's just part of getting old. But in reality, symptoms are kind of our body's way of waving a red flag, right? And so looking at metabolic dysfunction, and I want to dig a little bit into syndrome. I think I saw a statistic the other day, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's somewhere around 93% of people in America have metabolic syndrome. Something along it's extraordinarily crazy. Only 7%, I think that's only 7% of people, do not have, I think, 3 out of the 5 criteria. And part of those criteria include high blood pressure, waist circumference, and it's different for men and women. You've got different aspects of your cholesterol panel that are involved in that. There's 5 criteria that if you meet, I think it's 3 out of the 5, you're diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. But really, those are indicators that there may be some sort of metabolic dysfunction going on, right? And what I see a lot in chronic disease, when we look at the root cause behind diabetes, cancer, things like even autoimmune diseases, dementia, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, all of these things, a lot of times the root cause is the same, right? And what is your experience with that?
Inflammation, right?
Yeah. Bingo. Yeah.
Am I reading your mind?
You were reading my mind. I was trying to lead you without saying it. So
Yes. So it really is rooted in inflammation, which is why I can see you're bringing it back full circle to fasting. And because when we promote cellular autophagy, cellular housekeeping, taking out the trash, that's a way of reducing inflammation in ourselves and in our patients as well. And you're right. These syndromes or symptoms are not going to just show up out of the blue tomorrow. They have been happening at low level for many years. And in some cases, especially in the instance of heart disease, 20 years, 10, 15, 20 years for a heart attack you get to the point where then a heart attack happens.
Yeah. And a lot of times our modern healthcare system misses that point because, you don't have symptoms and your cholesterol panel is kind of okay. And yet we still see people having heart attacks. And that didn't happen today. That happened decades ago. And in the process of inflammation has just finally gotten to the point where there's been a breaking point.
I think we should talk about inflammation because inflammation is it's a great thing until it's not.
You're right. Acutely wonderful. Yeah. Chronically terrible.
Yeah. One of your kids falls off the monkey bars at school, scrapes his knee, and then what happens? If inflammation didn't happen, he'd probably just bleed out. But the beautiful thing is that we have all of these inflammatory mediators and all these cells that come to the scraped knee and heal it. And then the body sends a signal once it's healed saying, all right, thank you very much. Now you can stop and you can go focus on something else. That's great. But if we're talking about low-grade inflammation that happens in the cardiovascular system, right, that eventually 2 decades later leads to a heart attack, that's something that we have control over, and we have control over not allowing it to become a chronic inflammatory process. We can't talk about this without discussing nutrition. Mm-hmm. And there are a few things that irk me more than hearing that someone goes in for cancer treatment and they have been for months and years, and the doctor has never asked them what they eat. It's the one thing we have to do every single day. Eat, okay, and sleep. But, really, we need to be having that conversation with our patients, because the reason I say that is, at least in my work, especially with genetic testing, because it's a test where I can actually see what's going on in the patient. If I never asked them about their food and I didn't help them rule out high inflammatory foods,
yes,
a lot of times they have no idea what these high inflammatory foods are, right? So in the world of nutrigenomics testing, which is the type of genetic testing I do, I focus a lot on the foods. And so when I'm looking at a patient's symptom profile, and then I'm looking at the results of their tests, I can connect the dots for them and say, hey, I can understand why you're experiencing disrupted sleep or trouble around your menstrual cycle or some of these other things, because I can say, well, you show that you should not be eating this many strawberries or avocados or bananas or foods that are very healthy, right? And we love them and they're delicious, but maybe they don't match up for what your body needs. And so really anything that the body does not agree with or like will create an inflammatory reaction. So if we don't know that strawberries are a trigger for us and we're just eating because we think that they're healthy, that is an example of low-grade inflammation that over the course of several decades, we may be making even nutritional choices that we don't recognize are causing issues. But the good news is we have control over that. We can absolutely change what we eat.
And I love that. That gives us hope. Because, a lot of the things we're talking about, those are kind of grim diagnoses, right? These chronic diseases that and a lot of times we say, oh, it's genetic. There's some truth to that. Some things are tied genetically. A lot of times they're tied to the situation we grow up in. So my dad had heart disease and I have heart disease. Well, we ate the same things. Not so much genes, but more so conditioning. And I love that you give us that hope that, there's a better way to live. We don't have to live under the assumption that we're just going to one day have all these chronic diseases. Our health span is going to be short. Our lifespan is going to be short. Our quality of life is going to be poor. So we better just live it up while we can, because one day it's all going to come crumbling. Right? Because then essentially what we're doing is when we're living it up while we can, we're sabotaging ourselves to make that come quicker. But you're giving us hope, because you're telling us what we put in our mouth. And I'm just going to go spiritual here for a minute. One of the things that's been convicting to me over the last several months has been the scripture that tells us, 1 Corinthians, that tells us that our bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit. And when you think about that, think about the temple in Bible times. That place was immaculate. They took care of that temple because that was the place. They had the Holy of Holies. That's where the presence of God resided. But now the presence of God resides in us, and our bodies are a temple. But yet we neglect that temple so many times. We don't think about how we're treating that temple. And what I want to say is that it matters how we treat our bodies. And how you treat your body today, the food that you put in your mouth, the amount of movement that you have, the amount of stress that you have in your life that's going unchecked and not being addressed and not being dealt with, all of those things lead to inflammation. And while it may not be that big of a deal now, you may just have fatigue. I think I read that that's the cause for the most healthcare visits in the United States is fatigue. You may just feel fatigue, not quite right, kind of brain fog type stuff right now. But over the years, it's going to take its toll. But we don't have to go down that road. We do have some control over whether or not that happens to us. And a lot of it comes down to nutrition. Fasting is, I'm going to say it this way, correct me if I'm wrong, fasting is one of the tools we have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we actually have a responsibility. We've been given these bodies and we have a responsibility to upkeep them. And just like, think about your most maybe your most expensive or treasured item in your home, or the china, in the credenza or something like that. You keep it pristine. You hand wash it. You scrub it. You do all of these things to maintain it. And I really think a big problem is we've allowed ourselves to get so busy. And I am the first one to admit this, because I inherently will try to put everything on my plate. But then I just get a bigger plate. And I will just keep absorbing to-dos. And so nobody's perfect at this. It's really hard.
It is.
Especially when you are a driven individual who wants to help, who wants to serve, who wants to, help in all of these different areas, especially as healthcare professionals. We want to make ourselves accessible. And as pharmacists, we're trained to do that. And we always make ourselves available. And it's actually a really beautiful thing that we can do that. We don't have to charge for every single interaction or note that a patient sends us. We have the opportunity to do that. So I think also taking an inventory of what is on our daily to-dos and getting more comfortable in saying no. Mm-hmm. And after you say no, give yourself a pat on the back and say, I'm proud of myself. I did that, because you made time for yourself. A change that I recently made because I was really feeling a struggle with what we would call work-life balance is after I work at the pharmacy every day, I come home and I take all of my calls for my genomics testing clients. So my days are long. And it's a privilege to be able to do that. I also find myself neglecting me if I just keep going, just blowing and going. So it's something as simple as blocking off my Wednesday evenings. That's me time. Even if I get to do an extra load of laundry, I feel good about that. Or if I just get to say, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to enjoy the sunshine and go for a walk today. And just that small shift has actually been really healing for me, which hopefully is reducing my inflammation and my stress and, protecting my longevity and my health span.
Yeah. We have to do that. And I've learned it the hard way. There was a period in my life where I was a yes man. Anytime anybody wanted me to do anything, yeah, because I wanted to help, We're in a helping profession, and that's kind of what we do. And, then of course I'm also a minister, and that's it's a whole nother thing. And so I didn't have boundaries. And I think that's the big word we're talking about here is boundaries. And all of my worlds kind of just came together, and there was really no time for me. And my body reached out to me I say that kindly. It didn't feel kind at the time. Those symptoms, again, are red flags, right? And so I had chest pain, palpitations, shortness of breath. Thought I was having some sort of heart issue. Did all the tests. Everything came back fine. My doctor came in and said, hey, Chad, good news. Everything's great. I'm like, well, good, but I don't feel great. And then he's like, would you say you're busy? Would you say you're stressed? And my first instinct was no. And I thought for a second, and I said, well, probably. He said, tell me your schedule. And I told him my schedule. And he said, no. You need to just empty your schedule, keep it that way for a little while, then slowly add back, but never get to this point again. The point of all that is saying that boundaries are important, not only in our relationships, but for our bodies. And, if we don't manage that, then it's kind of manage us. And I learned that the hard way. But yeah, it's so important to be able, a lot of times we're in that hustle culture, right? To where we push. We work, and there's no time for us. But, that's part of this whole conversation. The rhythm of rest, right?
Rhythm of rest.
Our bodies, our cells need a rhythm of rest. Periods where we're not constantly bombarding them with food and work to do. And our bodies, our souls, our spirit, our physical bodies as well, body, mind, and soul. We need those rhythms of rest as well. That's the way we were made. God rested on the seventh day. I don't think he was tired. I think God rested on the seventh day to show us, hey, this is a pattern for you, because you're going to need this rhythm of rest too. And so, man, I love how we've brought all that full circle. Last thing I want to mention to you is, can you tell us about, okay, we talked about genetics. This is your big deal here. A lot of times we think that's just my genetics, that's just my DNA, that's just how it is. But there are epigenetic changes that happen. And that's a big fancy word. I'll let you unpack it a little bit for us. But can you give us the 30,000 foot view of what it looks like for different environments in our body, either chronic stress, inflammation, and how that can turn on or off genes and affect basically our propensity for chronic disease, but then the power of tools like fasting, nutrition, exercise, and all that to shift that the other way?
Yes. And actually, I'll give you an example, because this is what I'm starting to see more trends for those people that I genetically test. My nutrigenomics testing is just a form of genetic testing that focuses on wellness. So it looks at how the body relies on our genetic makeup to pull nutrients out of foods or vitamins, minerals, things like that, because the way that I do it and you do it are going to be completely different, how our bodies respond. So that's what we're evaluating. Some of the main markers I look at on my test, and there's several, but I'll mention two in regard to your question, are cellular autophagy and inflammation in a lot of depth. Now, my relevant example is that we are 5 years post-pandemic. And so medicine looks different for us today than it did 5 years ago. And so to be able to pivot and help our patients best, we have to understand what some of those changes are. The number one biggest change I've seen in the last 5 years is that our cells have become metabolically hijacked. And that's a result of a few different things. But either way, it's exposure to too much of especially the spike protein that sits on the outside of that SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? So not to get too much in the weeds about that, but what I see repetitively is that I have so many patients that have been in a chronic state of inflammation for so many years, like within the past 5-year period. The ones that come to me the very sickest are exhibiting those symptoms that are in alignment with everything you just said about metabolic dysfunction. But why, when we've all been exposed to COVID, repetitively over the past several years, why is this person that I'm evaluating so sick, where the next person is just going along like, I think I had COVID, but I don't really know. Mm-hmm. So when I look at their genetic profile, their inflammatory genes, the genes that are responsible for turning on and off inflammation, what I see is their genes are really good at turning on inflammation, but not so great at turning it off. And nearly 100% of the time, their markers for cellular autophagy, so their body's ability to detox well, is terrible. It's not good. And so the the insult that we experience, whether that's a childhood trauma or a illness that's significant, something is going to trigger us, even at a genetic level, that is going to shift our path of health or maybe shift us down a path of illness.
Sure.
So that's what epigenetics is, basically, is what I just explained. So if I test your genes, Chad, today, or I test you in 8 years, I'm going to get the same results because your genes are your genes. But the reason that genetic testing is encouraging is because it gives us insight to what our baseline is, our baseline requirements based on our genetic makeup. And it tells us, well, where do we need to support the body a little bit better to help it mitigate inflammation? So that those inflammatory genes are not constantly turned on and we're living in a state of inflammation all the time. Or how do we help your cells push out those toxins better? How do we use foods? How do we use fasting? Because fasting is my very favorite tool for promoting cellular autophagy and detox. One, because it's free, and I think we should utilize those free tools as often as we can.
100%.
And two, nothing really gets us into cellular autophagy or even ketosis faster than fasting. And so that's how we utilize these time-restricted eating and nutritional decisions to optimize our body and course correct back to the wellness path rather than the illness path.
Yeah.
And for me, that's how it all kind of comes full circle in understanding that information at a genetic level in our beautiful bodies that God has given us. It's just so cool. I love learning and talking about this stuff.
Yeah. I love it. And you do such a good job of explaining that where we can easily understand it. So last thing, I want to highlight your publication recently. You were actually, was it the inaugural episode of there's an independent journal? So I'll let you tell us about that. You're doing some pretty cool research with, was it canker sore medication?
Yeah.
In battling mast cells. But I'd love for you just to kind of give us a brief overview of that. And then when you're finished, if you could tell us how to enter into your world. You post a lot of incredible stuff. So tell us your social media handles, but then also where can people find you to work with you for nutrigenomics and that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, thanks, Chad. No, I love talking about this stuff, and I'm glad you find the information to be valuable because that's supposed to be the point. I promise I didn't plan this, but I actually have a copy.
And look at you.
Right here, because I just picked it up last week. So this is the first edition of the Journal of Independent Medicine. So the organization that used to be called the FLCCC is now the Independent Medical Alliance. And so what I love about this is it's a non-biased journal, and the publications that are put in there are submitted anonymously to the chief editor to decide if they want to accept them or not. And none of these publications push big pharma drugs. We're simply presenting the research that we're seeing clinically. So one area that I have really been focusing on in the past several years that has cropped up a lot because of COVID exposure is patients with their mast cells being overactivated, which is just a type of immune cell. And it's playing into this whole conversation that we're having, is they're in a chronic state of inflammation. But for these people have such a limited diet. They maybe can eat 5 to 6 foods if they're lucky. I've literally had some of these people tell me that they're allergic to water. But what that tells me is, they're allergic to the contaminants that are in the water.
Something in it, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there for these people. They can't handle the EMFs, the Wi-Fi. They're highly sensitive. So what our publication was about is I co-published 3 case studies with a physician out of the Carolinas, actually. And we came together to talk about how our patients are really improving in a promising way with a prescription medication that is available only through compounding pharmacies called Amlexanox. It's everybody's favorite to try and pronounce. And it used to be available, on the market several years ago as an oral paste that was used inside the mouth to help with ulcers. But we just kind of fell out of favor. Other products came on the market. But in many other countries, they still use this product as an oral capsule daily to help with asthma and allergies and calming down the immune system. So anytime that we use these compounded prescriptions for patients, we don't want to put a Band-Aid on the issue. We want to help, again, bring their body back into balance, help their body achieve homeostasis so that it stops playing defense all the time, but can recover and start playing offense. So we had some really nice publications in here about mast cell activation syndrome, Sjogren's, autoimmunity, asthma, allergies. And it's so neat to be able to use an affordable tool for patients to really help them live out their normal daily life. Because a lot of these people do not have normal daily lives.
Right.
They've had to, their relationships, their families have been split apart. They have to stop working because they're so sick. So that's an organization I would say keep an eye on if you're looking for unbiased information. And actually a lot more research on the topic we're talking about today of metabolic dysfunction. So that's IMA.org, the Independent Medical Alliance, which I have no official affiliation with. I just refer to them a lot because they're doing great work. But as far as my genetic testing, I am most active on Instagram. So my handle there is Dr._Bryana Gregory. And my website is BryanaGregory.com. You can learn all about me and my story. And, much like you, I've had health challenges that have led me to this path of the work that I'm doing today to help people recognize internally the gift and ability that their DNA gives them to heal so that we can get really intentional and really personalized about our approach to healing. So I love the questions I get on there. And I like to post a lot about what I'm doing because I'm a firm believer that if I'm going to recommend anything to anybody, I should definitely try that first myself so that I know what they're going to expect.
Yeah. And your book's on there as well, right?
Yeah. My book's on there as well, Healed for Good. And that's a book that I wrote on how nutrigenomics testing helps to play an integral role in the overall healing process. I do believe that God has given our bodies the ability to be healed for good. And again, like we talked about, it's a responsibility for people. But one of the beautiful things I see as a result of genetic testing people is at the end, they go, this is amazing because I just saw the results for my own body and I actually feel encouraged. So This is not news that is going to tell us, oh, we've just been dealt these genes. It's going to give us a roadmap to how we heal in a customized way so that it actually works. And we're not yo-yoing back and forth on this health journey that I see so many people go down. They get really intentional so that they remain successful with their changes.
I love that. And I love the work you're doing. Keep on doing the important work of helping people to realize that they can have an impact in their own health, that they don't have to go down the road that their genes have given them, that we have a choice and we can be better. So thank you, Dr. Gregory. What a privilege this has been. And hey, we're going to have to just make you a regular. There's so many things I'd love to talk about. You have such a gift with words.
Thank you.
So thanks again. Appreciate you. You guys check her out and look forward to having you again on the show sometime.
Yeah, Chad, thank you so much. And I just want to say, I think I'm probably actually to subscribe to 3, maybe 4 podcasts, yours being one of them, of course. And I'm just so blown away by the way that you're able to ask questions and pull out really great information from your guests. It's very uncommon to walk away from every single episode on a podcast with implementable information. And somehow you're able to do that. So I want to congratulate you and thank you for that. You're doing excellent work. So thank you for having me on today.
Thanks so much. We'll talk soon.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Rev Rx Podcast. We hope you enjoyed what you heard today, and if so, we'd love it if you would hit that subscribe button so that you'll never miss a new episode from us. Also, feel free to leave us reviews and comments as we'd love to hear from you. Be blessed and be the very best you.